Welcome to Shareholder Primacy from Free Float Media, a podcast about activist investing, securities law, and all the ways the financial and legal worlds intersect and collide in real life. As our followers know, I'm usually here with Ann Lipton, who's a law professor at Tulane, but Ann is once again going to another conference. So we invited Jeff Gramm, the founder of occasional activist hedge fund Bandera Partners, and author of one of the best books in recent memory on activist investing, Dear Chairman. Hey, Jeff, say hi.
Hi, thanks for having me, Mike. And I'm sorry that I can't be Ann, but I'll do my best.
Ann is sorry that you can't be her too, but she normally likes to do this. But when we talked about having the Dear Chairman guy on, she was kind of pumped. So we got all sorts of stuff. Jeff and I have known each other quite a long time, and we can have a lot of fun with this and talk about all sorts of interesting stuff. But I'd like to kind of cover sort of activism, talk a little more about Bandera, and then also cover the book, probably kind of in that order. So let's start with Bandera, if we may. That's your fund. Kind of curious, what kind of stuff are you working on kind of activist-wise, or maybe not activist-wise, at Bandera these days? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Bandera is kind of a classic value fund. We're really concentrated. We do 10 to 15 positions. And I don't really think of us as activists. If I'm serving on a board, it's usually because, something has gone wrong with the long thesis or there's a reason that it kind of devolved to the point that I'm engaging. Typically, we try to buy, stuff that doesn't quite demand intervention.
I don't
think of myself as a great activist.
You don't go into a given investment figuring how it's going to need to get fixed.
Exactly. And I think that, as you know, activism has become very specialized. And I think a lot of the best or the most committed activists, they really kind of come out guns a-blazing, right?
Yes.
They pick their targets.
Or they build the guns a-blazing pretty quickly.
Exactly. I mean, it can be a disadvantage to engage constructively first if it's going to ultimately devolve into a fight. And I think a lot of these folks have figured out just to come out fighting, and that's not really us. So, I've served on 7 public company boards. So,
all as a consequence of investments. It's not like
all
you were
through Bandera. Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
So
I've never yet said yes to a board
that's outside of not on a portfolio company.
Yeah. And I've thought about it, and I've had a few kind of interesting offers, but I haven't gotten there yet. Because it's a ton of work, right?
Right. Oh, yeah. What were some of the more recent boards you've been on? What were some of the?
I'm currently on 3, which I feel is a little bit too much. But I'm on the Tandy Leather board.
You've done that for a long time. That's been that forever. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Tandy Leather.
Yep, I've been on that for 11 years, and that board has gone through lots of changes, and I'm on 2 kind of new ones. I joined the board of the Joint Corporation beginning of 2024, and then I joined the board of a company called Innovative Food Holdings, maybe in 2023.
And when you were on each of those boards, were you basically doing that alone as sort of the Bandera person, or was there some other folks that you were able to kind of include in your joining those boards? How'd that work in terms of your who else was on the board kind of with you? Yeah,
so for Tandy and the Joint, it was alone, and then. Innovative Food Holdings was an interesting one because there was an activist involved, JCP, which is this guy, James Pappas.
James Pappas, right.
And I've actually served on 3 boards with him. And they were kind of in a funny situation where there were almost 2 factions on the board, James's faction and then the kind of incumbent faction. And they just couldn't really see eye to eye. And there was almost a cultural divide there. It was this kind of crew of hedge fund guys from Texas and then a bunch of Orthodox Jewish guys from Brooklyn. And And so I kind of came in to kind of help bridge that
help
gap,
kind of mediate things too.
Yeah. And and so there was a CEO change there. There has been, some board level changes there, but it's gone really well. And I think in a funny way, a lot of it was just, they weren't communicating that well when I got there. And so I was just, trying to bring it all together.
Trying to get people to talk to each other. And it sounds like that was also clearly Innovative Foods in the portfolio, in the Bandera portfolio. So you're able to make an investment and then kind of join the board to help do some, I don't know what the kind of turnaround is, and we don't have to cover it here, but to kind of help the board function a little better. Go ahead.
Yeah. So what happened there is they did a capital raise.
Yeah.
And both sides of the factions participated, and then I participated too. And
so there was some sort of like a pipe or something or whatever.
Yeah, it was a pipe. Yeah. So we did a pipe I think it was at 40 cents. I think the stock's over $2 now.
Oh.
And our new CEO is like, we're really doing a great job. Like he's, we brought in some good customers. It's not inherently a great business, but it can be a good business if executed well. Like it's basically food distribution. And so I think just like the leadership change was helpful, and then the board overhaul was helpful.
So you were an effective director in bringing the two different groups together, at least as shown by share price. So your LPs are pretty happy with how that's worked out.
Yeah, I think it's been pretty good. I think it's probably time for me to move on there. I think the company's in a good position.
Oh, good. So you can kind of focus on. Well, you said 3 boards. I mean, especially in running a portfolio. That's. I mean, I would expect some of the proxy advisors are looking at, man, he's overboarded. He's been on Tandy 11 years. So you're probably having to defend a little bit of some of these decisions at some point. So,
yeah, I think they're right. I think that 3 is probably too much.
Yeah, especially I've always thought that on the one hand, it's kind of easy for a portfolio manager to say, no, I'm going to find some independent. I don't want to be restricted in trading and so forth. And I just, I don't have time for this. On the other hand, and I'd be kind of curious about your view on this, is that I've always maintained that one of the most important things, and one of the most important signals a portfolio manager can send is by joining a board, him or herself. Given that time is, clearly one of the most precious resources, for you to say, look, I'm going to spend the 100 to 200, whatever hours a year it's going to take. This investment's important enough to me that I'm going to be on the board here. That, it's not necessarily forever, though. Clearly, Tandy, sometimes that stuff does happen. I was on my first board for like 10 years, too. It required that kind of attention. But that sends a really important message to the company, to your LPs, that this investment's a big enough deal that I'm going to put some time into it. Is that something is that kind of a little bit of the mindset you bring into this?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's important. I mean, look, I think it's always valuable to have a shareholder in the boardroom. And and in the end, a representative of a shareholder is not the same thing. And I think it's a culturally insensitive phrase, but there's like a risk of going native.
Yeah, no, that's right. You're absolutely right.
That I've seen happen a lot. You
get captured. You get captured by the company.
Absolutely.
You get captured by the executives. You get captured by other independent directors that have this allegiance or this affinity for the incumbents. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I've seen very long tenured friendships end over this exact thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's, look, in the end, being on a board is hard. Not being kind of captured by the social element is hard. And then there's also the kind of there's an economic imperative too, that if you are a well-liked board member, then you'll do well on that board.
Right.
So to me, I have always found it hard to kind of outsource that role. I think there are some fund managers who will they'll have a guy, right? They'll have one person.
They're designated, right? They have
a
small group of people. Yeah, right. Yeah.
So I was a big fan of a fund called Raging Capital.
I remember
And
those
Bill
guys.
Martin had this guy, Ken Traub, where,
Yeah.
Ken served on a lot of boards for Bill. And so the
Yeah.
risk that he would kind of go native were incredibly low, right?
Right,
But
exactly.
like for me, it's kind of like I've never gotten there where like I have my trusted, soldiers. So I
Sure.
just tend to do it myself. And
All right.
again, activism for us isn't a key part of the strategy. And so often,
Yeah.
when it comes around that there's a board that I feel like we need representation, it's kind of
Yeah.
like, well, I got us into this mess. I have to.
I'm going to get us out, or I'm going to put the time in to see if I can get us out. So how did, there were some other, you said you've been on 7 boards, you've done a lot. What were some of the really most notable, not just recently, but you started Bandera, in, I think, 2006 or something like that?
Oh, 06.
06. So since then, what were some of the biggest activist situations you've encountered? There was the one where you had the pipeline, but there are others that are worth mentioning.
Yeah, I don't think I've done anything that will garner a bunch of headlines or anything. I mean, for all 7 of them, they did result in a CEO change. And so, like, as we know, activism is often, despite all of the kind of language going back and forth, it's often just about the leadership. And so,
Yes, well, that's the main job of the board, is to supervise, is to hire, supervise, and sometimes terminate the executive team. You're the investor representative in you make some key decisions about capital allocation and so forth, but your main job is to hire a CEO.
Yeah. So I got all
7 times you fired the CEO. Wow.
And then I've been on a few where we sold the company. I was on one where we liquidated. That was a company called Ambassadors Group.
I remember that one, I think.
Yeah, that was a really hard decision. It was a once great business that in the kind of era of information and the internet and all these other things, the decline of direct mail, that just became a much less good business.
Yeah.
I've been on a bunch of kind of, different kind of situations from mature cash, flowing, to something like Innovative Foods that it really needed just a complete overhaul.
Yeah, got it. And it takes a lot of time, a lot of, getting to know the executive team and the board and so forth, especially that one you had to mediate different views about what success would look like. So I got one more quick question about sort of Bandera, and then a couple of things I want to ask about. Bandera looks like it's going to be able to get its driver's license pretty soon, or it's going to be able to drink. It's almost 20, right? Yeah. So, when you set up Bandera, it wasn't to become an activist, or was it? How did activism kind of feed into the origin story of the fund?
I had my background in distress, and I've always thought that distressed investing is just a great way to learn. Because it's a lot about valuation, but it's a lot about the governance. Yeah. There's a whole workouts aspect of it, and then the trading, right? In distress markets, the liquidity is just there in these brief bouts, right? So there are moments that you can buy, and then you're kind of stuck with it. And so that was my background, and in distress, activizing was in the toolkit, right? Sure. So, I mean, it was almost before there were, really committed activist funds. And a lot of the kind of early activists,
or at the same time, there was a lot of there were a very small number.
You had Bob Chapman, you had Chapman, Dan Loeb to a certain extent. Maybe you could call a committed activist, but I feel like he was also the same way. From the distressed / equity workworkouts, a special situations thing. So it was just a part of the toolkit. And then in a funny way, activism has continued to be relevant. Distress investing has kind of struggled in lots of ways.
Oh yeah, in the last few years, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many other things that could kind of affect it. So yeah. So all right. So it's always been. So it wasn't when you started it. It was bringing like kind of this background in how distressed, well, probably dad or whatever works, and it sort of equipped you to become an activist, but it wasn't because you wanted to be an activist investor in
no, and I don't feel like I have like, I don't feel like I have the dispositional fit,
well,
like to be a great activist.
Well, okay, hold on.
I mean, like for us, it's always valuation first.
I don't know.
Find a good stock.
You teach activism and you've written about activism. So let's ask about the teaching part of it and then take a quick break. So you're into activism enough where you have a bunch of MBA students, right? Tell me about that.
So I teach the shareholder activism class at Columbia Business School. I think that kind of came through my book. And, I taught value investing at Columbia from 2010 to 2017.
Right.
And I have a co-teacher, this guy, Terry Contos, who works at TIAA CREF. And, so he's a big passive investor. He's like the guy that gets, when Google, changed their name to Alphabet, like they called up him like to bounce it off of him. He's like that kind of guy.
Right. So he oversees this enormous passive portfolio.
Yeah,
but nonetheless, it has a lot of voting power.
Yeah, it's active actually. I mean, like he picks the stocks, but it's like $35 billion, and he's often in any of this of these situations. He's often the top holder that's actually actively managed, right? And so he knows a lot about governance, and so we teamed up, and I told Columbia, I don't know, at least like 5 years ago that we're the perfect people like to teach
to teach the MBAs, and it's MBAs, right? It's not like PhDs.
Yes, MBAs.
So it's a bunch of people you're going to launch into the world to go into banking or consulting or so forth.
Exactly, and we basically just do live cases. Like each week, like we'll do like a live activist case. We'll try to bring in the activist. And
to just talk about it and ask questions and help people kind of understand the mindset and the thinking that go into this.
Exactly.
Do you ever get? It's not difficult or not as difficult to get an activist fund manager in New York to come and guest for 90 minutes at a class. Do you ever get the companies to come in?
Yes, and that's the one great thing about Zoom.
Yeah. Oh,
is that you can often have both sides. So if they were both going to come in person, you couldn't do it. I mean, and I think a lot of times like they might not want to do it if they knew the other side was involved too.
Okay.
But like with Zoom, like, you can bring in both sides and you hear the case and then the students get, to decide. And I think, I think in the end, like MBA programs aren't especially academically rigorous.
Right.
And
I'm
sure. They're very focused on, on getting a job. They're very focused on the on the networking. Right. It's not that easy to build a course where they can really learn, Yeah. And I feel like doing it this way where it's active cases where you're hearing from the source, it's a good way to learn. And that's kind of how I wrote the book too, is just I could try to write this like history of shareholder activism, but that would be like extremely dry and no one would read it. And so if you can build it around historical cases, then it becomes compelling.
A little more interesting. Well, hold that thought, because I think we want to give our followers here a little bit of a break. Sure. So let's return to that subject and some more broader views about activism in the world. In a moment. So we'll take that break now and return to talk more with Jeff Gramm of Bandera Partners here at Shareholder Primacy.
Shareholder Primacy is brought to you by FreeFloatAnalytics.com, the only free database of corporate directors, their influence, and their performance. If you own a stock or retirement plan, go to FreeFloatAnalytics.com and look up which of your elected directors are performing well and which aren't. Use your vote in the alternative democracy and get your data at freefloatanalytics.com. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Shareholder Primacy. I'm Mike Levin, here talking with Jeff Gramm of Bandera Partners. We started talking a moment ago about the book, Dear Chairman, and I would love to learn more about that story. How did it come up? how'd you did the research? Where'd you get the idea? So let's delve into that a little bit, if we may.
Sure. I'm gonna try to remember it. It was it's like the book is
been a
now
while.
8 years old, right?
Yeah, right.
So, like in some ways in my mind, it's like becoming legend.
Right.
But
Do you still get residuals, right? Someone sends you a $20 check every 6 months, right, for a little bit of sales.
well, I got a pretty big advance, so I'm not sure
really?
I'm gonna get those residuals. Like I occasionally get like the international license fee and stuff, but I don't think I've recouped yet.
Oh wow! Wow!
But
So
I think
in
I
advance.
must be close though.
Okay, fine. All right. So, but that the advance was later. Where'd the idea come from?
Yeah. So well, first of all, I've always loved writing. I've always, fancied myself a writer, and I've always thought that one day I would do maybe like a pop science book or something. Like I always take pride in our long, quarterly letters and our annual letters.
Oh, for the fund investors.
Yeah, for Bandera. Yeah,
Right,
and then
I've seen those. They're elaborate.
Yeah, and I always like as a younger investor in the kind of early aughts, I always collected the Dear Chairman letters. They were much more colorful back in the day. All those Angry Dan Loeb letters and Bob Chapman letters.
Bob Chapman letters, right? There were some legendary letters that would become public. They'd send it as a news release or a securities filing or something, and we used to read this and they were just so entertaining.
Yeah,
and the language was so colorful. Yeah, right. So okay, go ahead.
Yeah, because they taught you. They would also, besides the kind of anger about the governance, they were also trying to pitch the stock to the readers, right? And so they talked about valuation
and talk about the flaws in the strategy, or exactly.
Okay. So I always thought it was a great way to learn.
Okay.
And so I kept them, and every time a young person would email me for advice on what books to read. Nowadays I'm like, well, here are some podcasts.
I have one for you.
But back then it was there's not that many books, but there's a bunch of papers, there's a bunch of speeches, and there's these letters, and I would collect them all. And then at some point I was like, well, there must be some book that has collected.
That compiles all these. That compiles all these. Not just the ones that you've been reading from the 90s and the aughts and so forth, but the ones that go back decades. And we all knew that there was some. Warren Buffett did a little bit of this. Well, you talk about it. There's some other really great examples. Yeah,
it's there are the Buffett ones out there, the Howard Schloss ones out there, the Benjamin Graham ones. Right. And so I just thought, well, there ought to be a book. This ought to happen. Right. Okay. And I remember Columbia had the Walter Schloss archive. When he died, all of his papers went to Columbia. And they were basically just boxes in an office. Yeah. I think I was the only person that ever went through them. But it had some Buffett letters. It had some Benjamin Graham proxy fight letters.
Now, who was Schloss again?
He was older than Warren Buffett, but a kind of compatriot. They were both analysts for Ben Graham and students of Ben Graham, and then they both launched their own funds.
Students of obviously Graham was a Columbia professor. So right. Yeah. Okay, got it.
Yeah, and Schloss was always just he was a real balance sheet guy, and just a liquidation analysis guy, a lot more than Buffett was in the end. Okay. And but
he had this archive.
Right.
Okay, go ahead. Sure.
Yeah, and I just thought there really there should be a book here, and so then I began I wrote to Buffett. He sent me his American Express letter. I wrote to Perot. I got his letter to GM. I went to the Rockefeller archive to try to find a letter that Ben Graham had written to the Rockefeller Foundation, which he wrote about in his memoir. But, I wrote his son, and the son didn't have any papers, but I found it at the Rockefeller archive. And so I had all these letters, and I knew, okay, this is going to be great. And then in the end, I just decided, well, a compilation of letters would be pretty boring. I should curate them a little bit. I should explain the background.
So rather than this wasn't going to be like a little case. It maybe the idea started as some form of a case book where just here's the letters.
Yeah,
where
and
you could
almost, like investing focus. Like it was going to be more like, here are some letters that will be useful to you as an investor, and then that kind of evolved into, well, let me explain these situations, and that's how it became about activism and corporate governance. And again, I've done activism, but I'm not an expert. I'm not a lawyer. I didn't feel like I was the worst person to write that book, but I wasn't the best person to write that book.
Right.
But
you were the person who wrote it. You were the person who wrote it. So what did you take away from the whole process of
I learned so much.
You read a ton of this stuff, and what are some of your big learnings, as we say?
Yeah, so it ended up just being 8 cases. So I dug into each of them like a lot, and they span through history, right? So I didn't know much about the proxiteers of the 1950s or the conglomerators of the 60s or like the corporate raiders of the 80s. Just all that stuff, like for me, was this incredible education. And finance. It's like in the end, there there was a lot of contemporary reportage about it, and there weren't lots of of history books about it. Like it's almost like it was beneath the history book level, right? But great contemporary journalism,
a lot of theory, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
But I think that now people care about it as history, and so I think that I was a little bit. The right time in the right place, to take all these incredible stories that had been written about at the time, and to package them in a book. And again, it's I learned so much about each of the kind of individual situations. And look, if you read about General Motors, it's kind of like the history of American business. It's the pension fund as we know it now was developed at GM. Kind of professional management was developed at GM. The whole kind of
or GE
focus
and
on
other
return of
places like that.
capital.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and so it was just a real education, and it was and because I was doing it, through the lens of an investor, I think it kind of resonated with the business reader, right? It's not too geeky on the corporate governance level, right?
Right.
It wasn't for the lay reader.
There's much more of a narrative about this rather than just kind of hitting home some of the lessons of activism and so forth. You get that too out of it. Now I'm assuming you assign it to classes, right?
I don't really. I give them one chapter. I give them the Carla Scherer chapter.
Okay.
So that's a chapter where this woman, Carla Scherer, did a proxy fight against her husband that was the CEO of a public company.
Yeah.
And the great thing about that chapter is that company had a great board. It was the board
really
was all of these, Detroit luminaries.
Yes.
But they were all kind of buddies with the CEO, and they felt like this was in their words, that this was a public emasculation. That that they didn't want to participate in, right? And so the board, that's a great chapter to kind of make the point that a board can be great on paper, and be comprised of accomplished and able people, and still not do its job as a board.
Right.
And so that's the only one that I use in class.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I said because it's a well honed technique to boost sales.
I know. I don't do it. I don't make them buy my book. I should, but so I just I pirate that chapter.
Fine, great.
And and I give it to them because in the end, as we talked about, I don't know that these kids are real readers. So
right. Well, not anymore.
That's good.
We could spend a whole nother podcast talking about kids these days, but. All right, let's turn to one other subject, then we can probably get moving on here. So we've talked a little bit about how you've started your fund and kind of what you learned as a board member and what you learned through writing this really interesting book. And you're right, there's just not that many really good, vibrant things you could read about activism along these lines. So this is great. What's some of your observations about applying all this, about sort of the state of activism these days? Again, you're not a hardcore activist the way some of the other folks we've talked about are, but you do enough of it that you probably have some views about kind of what's going on. What can we expect this year? Are you optimistic or pessimistic? Let's hear some opinions about this.
I mean, it's interesting this year. I feel like that the shareholders are getting impatient,
Okay. Oh, interesting. How so?
I mean, it was almost like there was like a little bit of a break during COVID, but I don't know. I mean, like, bigger picture, the biggest thing that has changed in the years that I've been in the industry is just how specialized it's all become. Mm-hmm. Right. And activism, when I began, it was a tool that a lot of different kinds of funds, used.
Or could use.
And a lot of them employed it. We'll sometimes casually, we'll sometimes to great detriment to the target company.
Sure, right.
But, it's become like very specialized, and it is the domain of a very small handful of funds. And so while activism, if you go by, the number of engagements, sure, that's up a lot. The number of activists is not, right?
But it's like increased a little bit. I mean, there's some folks who are kind of newer, but they're also displacing some guys who are kind of retiring. We don't hear about Bob Chapman anymore because I don't think he's really doing it.
And just like in general in the hedge fund, in the hedge fund industry, it's a little bit less, personality driven right now. There aren't like the celebrity hedge fund managers in their 30s anymore, right?
Right.
And so, like, I feel like the pendulum is going to swing, and we're going to see more activism by newbies. And
Like, I think it's already starting.
Like, and bad things about that. Yeah. And I think also I think there's a real sweet spot in the kind of like $1 billion to $5 billion market cap where I think there's going to be, more funds, that kind
a lot of companies
a
lot of companies that need activism in that range. And there's plenty. I mean, because I've always said, look, there's all sorts of opportunity for a shrewd investor to kind of do activism. There's way more companies with incompetent or dishonest management teams than there are portfolio managers to try to fix that. So there's going to be there's plenty of that. Okay, go ahead.
No, just the funny thing is I find, like, if I'm looking at a $200 million company, there's a lot of like little scrappy hedge fund managers that are looking at that company in the $1 billion to $3 billion range. In some ways, there's less, and I think at that range, like the real companies, they make real money typically, and they tend to have like pretty capable boards, which I think in the end is,
or at least
like,
capable on paper. Capable on paper.
Yeah.
There's still plenty of agency costs going on. There's still plenty of capture.
Totally.
And right.
Yeah, and you can add value by, being the shareholder in the room. But I think in the end, that's a great spot to be, like the $150 million company that's a little bit corrupt that's like a much harder situation.
Right. I mean, you still can make money at that, but if you really want to make some change, you're right, kind of focusing. So it sounds like that's a little bit of a hint about what Bandera might be looking at. I don't know.
No, probably not us. But I think there are these firms like Engage Capital and Alta Fox, and there's there's a lot of funds that like are focusing of companies at that size, and I think that they're going to have success, and there will be emulators. So I think there's going to be more, more activists.
Right. And again, there's plenty of folks who've done this. One of my favorite proxy. I think I kind of have a little hobby. I follow proxy contests that go to a vote because I'm kind of curious about how universal proxy affects it. And I have this list, and one of my favorite ones so far has been the one at Massimo, the tech company, where Politan Capital and Quentin Coffey, 2 years in a row, ran directors and won everything he was looking for.
Yeah.
And did it really shrewdly.
Massimo got really aggressive.
Yeah.
The one that I'm like the most interested in right now is the Beacon Roofing one.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
That's like in actual, there's like there's a hostile tender going on, and then there's going to be a proxy fight, like for something like 10 board seats.
Yes.
And I think that's going to be like.
I don't think they've announced. I thought at Beacon Roofing they had announced their opposition to a deal or support for some sort of a takeover, but they haven't announced the director situation yet. Is that right?
No. So there's this investor, Brad Jacobs, he's a great businessman. He has built, I don't know, maybe like 5 multi-billion-dollar platform companies, and he has decided his new platform industry is going to be building products. And he's kind of looking for his first big deal.
Yeah.
And so he made an offer to Beacon Roofing. Beacon Roofing said no. He launched a hostile tender. They put in a poison pill. Yeah. And so now he's going to do I think the tender is next week. Yeah. And then he's going to,
So after that,
I think he's announced a slate even. Yeah.
Oh,
and
he did.
I think it's going to be really like a fascinating one because he's not like, a specialized activist.
Right.
And
he's just more trying to, there's a source of value here, and he knows he has a good thesis about how to unlock it.
I think on some level he thinks I'm paying this really I'm offering this incredibly generous price. And I think he is. Like I think that and I think he thinks it's just going to be like that in the end that the voting shareholders
will agree with him.
Find the decision easy, and I'm not sure he's correct about that. And I think the way that they might approach a hostile tender, like the way those guys, I mean, like if you're Vanguard and you're looking at at a hostile tender, you kind of define it by if the offer price is at a premium, if the stock is lingering below that offer price, then you probably tender.
Something's right. You need to do that.
You let the market decide for you, and that's not the same decision-making process as a kind of a 10-person hostile slate, right?
No, correct.
So
I mean, the two can complement each other, but they're different. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Wow. Well, so we'll have to. I'm waiting to sort of see what Bandera's version of that, but we're going to be waiting a little long. I think. So anyway.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that hostile tender offers. And
no, I don't. It's not
slates
in,
for control.
Not in your
future.
strategy. But anyway, very cool. All right, I think we've subjected each other and our followers to enough here, so I think we're probably going to be able to maybe wrap up a little bit. How's that sound?
That sounds great. Thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks for joining me for this fun discussion. This is Shareholder Primacy, normally hosted by Ian Lipton and me, Mike Levin, but today with Jeff Gramm from Bandera Partners. I'm an independent activist investor and advisor to investors about their activist situations. Jeff, of course, is the founder of Bandera Partners. You can find me, Mike, at theactivistinvestor.com, and you can find Jeff at banderapartners.com. Our podcast is produced and distributed by Free Float Media. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again